The sound of my blades slicing the ice was a melody I had known since I was a child. The rink, with its sharp chill and the echoes of distant cheers, was my sanctuary, a place where dreams felt tangible. But more than anything, it was where Uncle Christopher had always been. Christopher wasn't just my uncle. He was my first coach, my first cheerleader, and in many ways my first love, though not in the way that word is typically understood. He'd been there when I first stumbled onto the ice at just 4 years old, my tiny hands clutching his as he patiently guided me through my wobbly steps. He had always said I looked more like a porcelain doll than an athlete back then. I would giggle and he'd grin, a playful sparkle in his eyes. He adored me, that much I knew. And I adored him right back. Christopher was different from my father in every conceivable way. While Dad was stern and unyielding, imposing rules that felt like chains, Uncle Christopher was freedom personified. He had a way of turning every lesson into an adventure. If I fell, he'd pretend to fall too, collapsing dramatically on the ice and making me laugh so hard I could barely get back up. And when Dad forbade me from buying the sequined costume I wanted for my first recital, Christopher had quietly bought it for me, winking as he handed me the bag. "I believe in letting a girl sparkle," he'd said with a smirk, his voice warm. Years passed, and under his guidance I grew from a tottering child to a master of the ice. I wasn't just a skater, I was a champion. And while the world saw a prodigy, I saw only him, the man who had held my hand through it all. But things felt different now. I wasn't the little girl who needed her uncle to steady her on the ice. At 19 I had grown into a woman, and I knew he saw it too. I caught the subtle change in his expression when he watched me perform, something unspoken lurking in the depths of his brown eyes. It wasn't just pride. It was something deeper, something that made my heart race. I had grown up with him practically, his presence as constant as the changing seasons. Christopher had 2 sons of his own, but our bond was something unique, forged in hours of shared sweat and triumph. On the ice, he wasn't just an uncle or a coach. He was my world. And yet, the line between us felt blurred in ways I couldn't ignore. It was in the way his hand lingered a fraction longer on my shoulder during practice, the soft edge to his voice when he corrected my form. It wasn't just affection. It was reverence, and it mirrored something that had been growing quietly inside me. I wanted to tell him what his attention meant to me, how it made me feel like more than just his niece or his student. But I couldn't. Some things were better left unsaid. This particular evening, as I practiced alone under the harsh fluorescent lights of the rink, I caught sight of him standing by the boards, arms crossed, his face unreadable. He looked older, though not in the way most people aged. His hair had more silver threads than I remembered, and his laugh lines had deepened. But he carried himself with the same magnetic confidence that had always drawn people in. "Your spins are tighter," he called, his voice cutting through the silence. "Good enough for nationals?" I teased, my breath fogging the air. He grinned, the kind that softened his whole face. "They've been good enough since you were 10. It was moments like these that unraveled me, when his words were laced with the quiet admiration he didn't dare speak aloud. Moments that left me questioning where we stood and whether I was the only one who felt the invisible tether pulling us closer together. I skated to the edge of the rink and leaned against the boards, catching my breath. He reached out, tucking a loose strand of hair behind my ear, a gesture so tender it sent a shiver down my spine. "You're extraordinary, Mia," he murmured. "Because of you," I replied, my voice trembling under the weight of everything I wasn't saying. Our eyes met, and for a fleeting second the rink seemed to disappear. It was just us, 2 souls caught in a current neither of us had chosen but both felt powerless to resist. And then, as quickly as the moment came, it was gone. He pulled back, his usual playful demeanor slipping back into place. "Go shower before you freeze to death. We've got an early session tomorrow." "Yes, coach," I said, my voice light but my heart heavy. As I left the ice that night, I couldn't shake the feeling that our story was only just beginning. The applause had roared like a storm, but all I could hear was the hammering of my heart as I stood on the podium, clutching my gold medal. The victory felt hollow against the sharp, throbbing pain in my knee. I kept smiling, waving at the crowd, but the strain was unbearable. Christopher had noticed. He always noticed. "Come on, Mia," he'd said afterward, his hand light on my shoulder as he guided me through the backstage chaos. "You need to get off that leg." "I'm fine," I protested, though I could barely put weight on it. But he wasn't having it. His voice softened and his fingers brushed against my cheek. "You're not fine, and I'm not letting you pretend you are. Later that evening, as I lay on the couch in our training suite, my knee wrapped in ice, Christopher leaned over me, his brows furrowed in a mix of concern and guilt. "I should have stopped you before the last routine," he muttered. "And deny me my gold medal?" "Not a chance," I teased, but my voice lacked its usual lilt. I saw how much it pained him to see me hurt. "You're taking a break," he declared. "No arguments." I knew better than to argue. When Christopher made up his mind, there was no swaying him. So when he suggested a trip to the Dominican Republic, a chance to rest, recover, and escape the weight of the ice, I didn't hesitate to say yes. The island air was a balm, warm and fragrant with salt and the faint sweetness of hibiscus. The villa Christopher had booked for us was perched on a secluded stretch of beach, the waves whispering against the shore like a lullaby. It felt like a world apart from the rigors of training and the expectations I had grown up with. He'd insisted on handling everything, unpacking my bags, preparing simple meals, and most of all tending to my knee. "Christopher, I can wrap it myself," I said one afternoon as he knelt before me, carefully securing the bandage. His hands paused and he looked up at me with mock severity. "You can. But you won't. Princesses don't wrap their own injuries." I laughed, though my cheeks burned. He was always like this, half playful, half infuriatingly caring. But beneath the humor was a devotion that made my chest ache. Each day bled into the next in a haze of sun-drenched mornings and moonlit evenings. We swam in the ocean, his strong arms always hovering nearby as if ready to catch me should I falter. We lounged on the porch, sharing quiet conversations that felt more intimate than they should have. And then there were the hugs. At first, they were casual. His arms slung around my shoulder as we watched the sun dip below the horizon, or a brief embrace after he helped me up from the couch. But over the days they lingered. His arms wrapped around me a little tighter, a little longer, until I found myself melting into him, craving his touch as much as the ocean breeze. It was during one of those quiet moments, the sound of the waves filling the air between us, that I finally found the courage to say what I'd been holding in for years. "Christopher," I began, my voice trembling as I looked up at him. He was sitting beside me on the porch swing, his gaze fixed on the distant horizon. He murmured, his eyes meeting mine. "I feel something," I said, barely above a whisper. "For you." His expression shifted, shock, denial, and something deeper flickered across his face. I didn't give him a chance to respond. Leaning forward, I pressed my lips to his. It was soft, hesitant, but it carried every unspoken word I couldn't find. For a moment he didn't move and I thought I'd made a terrible mistake. But then he pulled back, his hands gripping my shoulders gently but firmly. "Mia," he said, his voice hoarse. "We can't." "Why not?" I demanded, my heart pounding. "I've never felt this way about anyone." He sighed, running a hand through his hair. "You're young. Beautiful. There will be plenty of young, handsome men who'll love you the way you deserve." I shook my head, tears stinging my eyes. "I don't want them. I want you. No one's ever loved me like you do." His hands fell to his lap, and for a moment he looked as though he was wrestling with something monumental. Then with a sigh, he leaned forward and kissed my forehead. "You'll always be my Mia," he murmured. But the way he said it felt like both a promise and a goodbye. The next morning, the ocean was cool against my skin as we swam side by side. I couldn't tell if things had shifted between us or if we were both pretending that nothing had happened. But I didn't care. For now, it was enough to be here with him, to share these stolen moments. As the trip went on, our bond deepened. We found secret places on the island. A hidden cove, a quiet stretch of sand where no one could find us. There, under the cover of the stars, we spoke of everything and nothing, the unspoken tension between us crackling like the tide against the rocks. We sat by the fire pit overlooking the beach. I reached for his hand. He didn't pull away. "I wish this could last forever," I said, my voice barely audible over the crackling flames. His grip tightened, and for a moment he looked as though he might say something. But then he shook his head, a bittersweet smile playing on his lips. "Some things aren't meant to last, Mia." I wanted to argue, to tell him he was wrong. But the weight of his words silenced me. But I knew this was only the beginning of our story. The moon hung low in the night sky, a silver coin casting its glow over the Dominican shoreline. The waves whispered as they met the sand, a rhythm as steady as my heartbeat, though mine quickened, sensing the man lying beside me. "Christopher. My uncle. My coach. My constant." And now, the reason every breath I took felt fragile, as though one wrong word could shatter the delicate understanding that had grown between us. We had walked along the beach earlier, the sun sinking into the horizon, streaks of gold melting into twilight. He had been quiet, introspective in a way that made me want to understand the thoughts he kept hidden. But I didn't press him. I was content to let the evening unfold as it wanted. Now, lying on the warm sand, I stared at the stars above us. They felt closer here, as though the universe leaned in to witness whatever was about to happen. "Christopher," I whispered. He turned to me, the moonlight tracing the lines of his face. His expression, so familiar and comforting, now held something deeper. Something that made my pulse race. "Yeah." His voice was soft, careful. "Hold me." He hesitated, his brows furrowing as though he was weighing everything this moment might mean. Then he moved closer, his arms slipping beneath my shoulders and pulling me gently against him. I rested my head on his chest, breathing in the scent of salt air and his familiar warmth. Calmed me and thrilled me all at once. His voice broke the stillness, barely audible. "Mia, I can't keep doing this." I tilted my head to meet his gaze. "Doing what?" "Pretending I don't feel the way I do." His words spilled out, heavy with emotion. "I've tried so hard to push it down, to remind myself it's wrong. But I can't anymore. I can't stop thinking about you. About us." The world seemed to shift under me, the weight of his confession stealing my breath. Every grain of sand beneath me felt alive. "I love you, Mia," he said, his voice trembling. "Not as your uncle. Not as your coach. But as a man who has cared for you more deeply than I ever thought possible." Tears welled in my eyes. "Christopher." He cupped my face with his hands, his thumbs brushing away the tears that escaped. "I don't want to lose you. But I don't know how to keep this inside anymore." "You won't lose me," I said, leaning into his touch. "You couldn't if you tried." I kissed him, a gesture as natural as breathing. It was gentle at first, a soft expression of everything unspoken between us. But as his hands slid into my hair, his fingers weaving through it, the kiss deepened. There was no hesitation, only the surety that this was right for us, here and now. My hands found their way to his shoulders, steadying myself against the rush of emotions coursing through me. His touch, familiar yet tender in a way I hadn't known before, made the rest of the world fade away. Every moment, every sensation felt like a declaration of something profound and unbreakable. When we finally pulled back, our foreheads rested together, our breathing mingling in the quiet night. His eyes searched mine as though he still needed to know this was real. "Mia," he said, his voice low and certain. "Are you sure?" I nodded, my hands still cradling his face. "I've never been more sure of anything." He exhaled deeply, a sound full of relief and something more, an emotion so raw it made my chest tighten. "You have no idea how much I've wanted this. How much I've wanted you. You make me feel whole," I whispered. "Like I finally matter." His gaze softened and his arms wrapped around me, holding me as though I was something precious. "You're everything, Mia. More than enough. You've always been enough." We stayed there, wrapped in each other's arms as the stars above seemed to blur into one another. The steady rhythm of the waves was the only sound, a backdrop to the quiet promise we had just made to each other. The tide crept closer, the water lapping at the edges of where we lay, but neither of us moved. The warmth of his embrace was more than comfort. It was a sanctuary. "I don't want this to end," I murmured, my voice muffled against his chest. "It doesn't have to," he replied, his voice firm. "We'll figure this out, Mia. Whatever it takes." I lifted my head, my eyes meeting his. "You mean that?" His nod was resolute. "I'd give up everything for you. You're worth it." Tears of relief brimmed in my eyes. I leaned in, pressing a kiss to his cheek, then his lips. It was gentle, unhurried, full of gratitude and love. When the sun began its slow rise, the horizon painted in soft pinks and oranges, we finally stirred. He helped me to my feet, his hand lingering at my waist as we walked back toward the villa. The warmth of the morning sun mirrored the feelings that lingered between us, a quiet affirmation of the bond we had chosen to embrace. As the world began to wake around us, I knew one thing with unwavering certainty. Christopher and I had stepped into something uncharted, something powerful. And for the first time, I wasn't afraid to see where it would take us. Returning home from the Dominican Republic felt surreal. The warmth of the sun-soaked beaches still lingered in my memory, But now Christopher and I faced the reality we had deliberately left behind. Our bond had deepened and there was no going back. The question wasn't whether we could continue to love each other. It was how. My mother greeted me with her usual warmth, her eyes scanning my face as if she could sense the change in me. We had always been close, sharing secrets and fears with a bond stronger than most mother-daughter relationships. So I hesitated. How could I tell her something that would reshape her understanding of my world? That evening, while the house was quiet, I sat with her in the living room. She was knitting, her hands moving steadily, but her attention flicked to me every few moments. "Something's on your mind, Mia," she said softly, not looking up. "Spit it out." I smiled nervously. "It's complicated." Her knitting paused and she turned fully to me. "Complicated doesn't scare me. I'm your mom, remember?" Taking a deep breath, I began. "Mom, Christopher and we're in love." Her expression didn't change immediately, but her brows furrowed slightly as she processed my words. "In love," she repeated carefully. "Yes," I said, my voice trembling. "It's not just a crush or something fleeting. I know how it must look, but I love him." She set her knitting aside and leaned forward, taking my hands in hers. "Mia, I've seen the way Christopher looks at you. And the way you light up around him. I've known for a while that there was something special between you two." Her words stunned me. "You're not angry." "Angry," she said with a soft laugh. "No, sweetheart. But I do need you to listen to me carefully." She paused, her tone turning serious. "Christopher isn't your father's full brother. He's his half-brother. There's no biological connection between you two." My heart raced. "Are you sure?" She nodded firmly. "Yes. Your grandfather had Christopher with his first wife, and your father came later with me. They share a father but not a mother. So while some people might raise their eyebrows, you have nothing to feel ashamed of." Relief washed over me and I felt tears sting my eyes. "Mom, thank you. I was so scared to tell you." He pulled me into a hug. "Mia, I know Christopher cares about you deeply. He's always looked out for you and I trust him to keep doing that. And if your father has any objections, leave him to me." Her reassurance bolstered my confidence. For the first time I felt like this love, as unconventional as it was, had a real chance. Christopher and I didn't wait long to start our new life. With my mother's blessing and her promise to shield us from any unnecessary family drama, we began planning our move to California. It felt like the right place. A fresh start in a vibrant new setting where we could be ourselves without judgment. We found a beautiful house in a quiet, leafy neighborhood. It was everything we dreamed of. A cozy yet spacious home with a sunlit kitchen and a garden big enough for future dreams. Moving in felt like stepping into the life we had dared to imagine during those quiet nights by the ocean. Life settled into a rhythm that felt effortless. Christopher continued coaching, finding joy in helping young athletes achieve their dreams. I took up teaching figure skating, passing on my passion to the next generation. Our days were filled with laughter, shared meals, and a love that grew deeper with each passing moment. 3 years later, on a crisp autumn morning, I sat on the edge of the bathtub staring at the test in my hand. The 2 lines were unmistakable. My heart swelled with a mix of excitement and nerves as I thought about what this would mean for us. "Christopher," I called, my voice shaking slightly. He appeared in the doorway, concern flickering across his face. "What's wrong?" I held up the test, unable to speak. His eyes widened as realization dawned. "You're?" I nodded, tears streaming down my cheeks. "We're having a baby." For a moment he stood there, stunned. Then he crossed the room in 2 strides, pulling me into a tight embrace. His voice was thick with emotion. "Yeah, that's incredible. You're going to be an amazing mother. And you'll be an amazing father," I said, resting my forehead against his. I've never been more sure of anything. The months that followed were a whirlwind of preparation and joy. Christopher doted on me, ensuring I had everything I needed and more. He painted the nursery himself, a soft, serene green, and spent hours assembling furniture with the same meticulous care he brought to everything in his life. When our daughter was born, it felt like the culmination of everything we had worked for. The love, the sacrifices, the quiet moments of doubt that we had overcome together. Holding her in my arms, I felt a love so profound it was almost overwhelming. We named her Lily, after the flowers that had lined the path on our first walk together in California. She was perfect, with Christopher's eyes and a curiosity that already reminded me of him. Looking back, I sometimes marveled at the journey that had brought us here. From the ice rinks of my childhood to the sunlit beaches of the Dominican Republic, and finally to the warm, welcoming home we had built together, it had been a path neither of us could have predicted. But it was ours and it was beautiful. As I watched Christopher playing with Lily in the garden one afternoon, his laughter mingling with hers, I knew one thing with absolute certainty. I wouldn't trade this life for anything in the world.